I'm glad you've all come because I was saying to Grace, the more people in this room, the warmer we'll be. So I'm going to tell you a story from 1955. This time, there was a lot of, it was just after the war, and there was a lot of interesting ideas about innovation in science and the application of science. So our story starts with a scientist called Dr. Helen Spurway, and she worked at University College London, and she was doing some very interesting research. She was studying reproduction in guppies, the kind of fish children have at home as pets. And what she did was she took them at birth and she separated them into two tanks, one with only females and one with only males. And she noticed something interesting, that even though the females had been nowhere near a male, they continued giving birth, and the broods were very interesting. They were almost completely female. So she thought, one of three things could be happening. The first was that there could be something called hermaphrodites, which are like snails and earthworms. And hermaphrodites have both ovaries and testes, so they could have just been fertilizing themselves. The second idea she had was that the females could have retained sperm from somehow they got while they were in their mother's womb. And the third idea she had was that they were reproducing by a method known in biology as parthenogenesis, like the Parthenon, Athena, the virgin birth, in which no males were necessary. So she gave a talk late in 1955 at University College London, where she worked. And it was a public lecture, so there were students there, and there were also the lay public and academics. And she described the results I just told you. And someone asked, well, if you're seeing this in animals, is there any chance that it could be happening in humans too? Now, as I said, it was a time of great technological development, and there were a lot of things I didn't know the answers to, but the fact, she had seen it happening in her guppies, and she said, well, yes, I don't see why not. But again, 1950s, I think if it happened, women would not come forward for fear of social stigma. But, if it did happen, chances are the child would be a girl, and she would be intensely similar to her mother. And she said, I can test this. So that she can devise scientific and medical tests to check whether this was happening. Now, this lecture would have stayed within the halls of UCL had it not been for the fact that there was a journalist called Audrey Whiting present. And Audrey Whiting, this is a clip from her obituary. As you can see in the picture, she was an immense woman. She was very grand and tall. But she also achieved a lot of firsts for women at her time and as a journalist. And she was the one responsible for setting up a base in Hollywood for newspapers to work out of. And she was a good journalist. I mean, she worked for a tabloid as the forerunner of the Mirror. It was called the Sunday Pictorial. But she was known for her accuracy, and she had the trust of many, movie stars and things. So she thought this would be a great story, and she followed Helen Spurway around, and she cornered her in the hallway of the London School of Economics, and she said, "Can I run your story?" And Helen Spurway said, she said, "No, I don't speak to the popular press." But she was persistent, and she got the story. The editor put it on the front page. It doubled the circulation of the newspaper, because the lines on the page were, the headline was, "Doctors now say it does not always need a man to make a baby." And halfway down the page was a little box that said, "Find the case." And this box invited women to come forward if they thought that this is something that had happened to them. And amazingly, or not amazingly, because these are tabloid readers, 19 women came forward. Of them, 11 were disqualified immediately because they had an intact hymen, and they thought that was a mark of virginity. And many cultures, they believe that is so. However, the hymen it's a membrane that's semi-permeable, so it is possible for sperm to pass, and that pregnancy could happen. Very difficult, but it is possible. So the paper published an explanation where they said, to be a virgin mother, it doesn't have to be your first child, you don't even have to be a virgin, but you have to have thought that at the time that you became pregnant, you had had no contact with a man. So there were some women left. A few more were disqualified because they didn't have the same blood type. Now, if you're claiming that you had a child and the child had no father, this is the basic principle. The child cannot have any more genes than you had. So you have to be pretty you have to match pretty well. And so you should have the same blood type. That's a basic concept. The other pair was disqualified because they didn't have the same eye color. Again, they had to go. And finally, there was only one mother-daughter pair left, and this was a German woman called Emmy Marie Jones and her daughter Monica. Her daughter was 11 years old, and she had been waiting a long time to find out the circumstances of her daughter's birth, because she said, and she wrote to the paper with a note saying that I should tell you that I'm German in case you want to have nothing to do with me, because it was just after the war. She, 11 years previously, was ill, and she went into a sanatorium, much like this place would have looked like, and she spent several months there. I think she had rheumatism. She came out. 3 months later, she felt quite ill, so she went back to the doctor for a tonic. She said, a pick-me-up. And the doctor did some tests, and he said, Emmy Marie, I'm not surprised you're feeling poorly. You are, in fact, pregnant. And she described later, she said, I looked at him in complete disbelief, she said, because I knew the facts of life, and I knew that I had not been with a man. How could I have been? I was in an all-female sanatorium. That means all the patients were female and all the staff were female. And the doctor just said, you will soon see that I'm right. And sure enough, she was in Hanover. That's what it looked like. She lived in a cellar. She, when it was completely bombed by the Allies, and out she crawled with this baby, Monica. Now, the paper made mention of the fact that what was quite interesting about Monica and about Emmy Marie and her daughter Monica, were that they were intensely similar, not just in the way that they looked, but in the way that they behaved and they liked, much as people say about identical twins. And I think they probably do. It's quite hard to I spent a lot of time in the Collindale archives digging these pictures up, but there is a similarity. But you need more than that if you're trying to ascertain medically. Now, these tests, Helen Spurway ran these tests, and this pair agreed to the tests, and these tests were backed by the Medical Research Council, which is still one of the biggest, it's a government-linked medical funder. So they had massive support of good scientists and good doctors to run these tests. And these were the ones they proposed to run. Again, 1955 was only 2 years after the structure of the DNA helix was elucidated. So you couldn't do the genetics you do today, and today it would be quite easy to sequence it and know what's going on. They couldn't do that, but were doing tests that were sort of proxy for what was going on in the chromosomes. So they did blood type, came up the same. Phenylthiurea is quite an interesting test. It's a taste test. It's a chemical that has the property of either tasting intensely bitter or you're not able to taste it at all. And they came up with the same result in that. And then there was a secretor status. So secretor status means that, about 80% of the population with a European ancestry will be a secretor, and that means that you can detect your blood type in your bodily fluids, so in your sweat, in your saliva, and if you're a man, also in your semen. 80% of people are secretors, both of them were not. And then serum proteins, just looking at their blood again. The final test was a skin grafting test. Helen Spurway said this would be the most conclusive test if they agreed to it, because it's quite invasive. You're doing a minor operation on a child and on her mother and swapping the skin. And it works on the same principle as transplantation medicine. If you needed a kidney, you'd probably go to someone you're most closely related to. If you're lucky enough to have an identical twin, you'd go to them because they were genetically identical to you. And this was the principle. Remember, the child should not have had any more DNA than her mother had, so they assumed that the skin would stay on both of them for quite a long time. In the end, though they had passed all the other tests, they technically failed this one because they rejected the skin of each other within 6 and 4 weeks, respectively. But the probability that they had such intense similarity in all the other tests, and this was worked out by statisticians, meant that when they published the results of the paper, they couldn't categorically disprove what she was saying. They just didn't have enough information to say that. The newspaper, which followed the story throughout the entire investigation, published a more triumphant result, and they said, doctors say, we have been unable to prove that any man took part in the creation of this child, and that all our results are consistent with a virgin birth. My question when I found the story was, was Helen Spurway, completely mad to have launched a search for a human virgin mother. And there was great speculation within the scientific community. However, I don't think she was, because she saw it in fish. She was studying fish, and she saw that happening in an animal model. Also, we've known since the 18th century that aphids do it. They also have the potential to mate and have babies sexually, but they definitely do have young through parthenogenesis. It does happen in nature. Also, in 1940, a group of scientists reported that they were able to force rabbits to have virgin births just by cooling down their fallopian tubes. Now, this is significant because before we had insects and we had reptiles and snakes and things, but this is a mammal. Now, in the lab, in a petri dish, they've been able to get eggs to become embryos just by using UV light or other stimulus, by an influx of calcium. But they were saying that an actual animal, they were able to cause the rabbit to produce a single female child baby just by cooling down for her fallopian tubes. Now, the fallopian tubes are the tubes that connect your ovaries to your womb, and it's where all of us started life, because that's where fertilization happened. It was never replicated, but that was available data to Helen Spurway at the time. And also in the 1950s, there were proposals to create farms that were all female. There was a scientist in Edinburgh who said, why should we have male animals on the farms, because they're big animals, they take lots of care and expense, all for the sake of a little sperm. So he proposed farms with only sows and ewes. And the American government went one further, as usual. They actually created a line of virgin-born animals. That little chick you see there is a turkey, and it's called a white Beltsville turkey. And they managed to breed the animals selectively so that they created females who would reproduce predominantly through virgin births, which is one of the possibly genuine things about the virgin birth on your Christmas table. The reaction to that, I told you, scientists were still skeptical, even though there were precedents for how this could happen in nature. What I've got up here is a response from a publication called The Universe, which was a Catholic publication. And they were sort of, in a way, less skeptical than the scientists were. And they said, now God has the capacity to do these things. And if it were true, they said in the bottom, as Dr. Spurway has confidently asserted that it might happen, this would in no way undermine the miraculous character of our Lord's conception and birth. And that was 1955. And I put this up as well because I found an early church father called Origen in the 3rd century CE. Now, he was in Rome, and Christians were being persecuted. And he was trying to convince people that there was nothing so strange about a miracle that God can produce Jesus as the son of a virgin mother. Now, I remember in the Roman pantheon and in Greek mythology, there were lots of stories of virgin birth. And I think what he was saying was pretty much, the last paragraph is pretty much exactly the same as what The Universe published in 1955, that if God wanted to do this, it would be possible. So if you look into the mythology of different cultures, a lot of them that stem from the Mediterranean region have some kind of myth of a virgin birth. And when you look at it very carefully, a lot of the virgin mothers, they say in the literature, have the same root or similar root as the name of Mary. So we have Mira, the mother of Adonis, Maya, the mother of Hermes, Maya, the mother of Buddha, and Mary, the mother of Jesus. And Mautmis. Mautmis was an Egyptian princess, which you might recognize the story from the story of Mary and Jesus, that she was a princess, and she was led by a messenger of God to a cross, which she kissed, and she was told that she would conceive and have a son. And I couldn't there's a long, long list, so I just printed this out here, and I'll read it for you very quickly. So there's the river nymph Nana was miraculously impregnated by a falling pomegranate. Her son Attis became the lover of Cybele, the mother of the Greek gods. Hera, the wife of Zeus, and thus the queen of heaven, renewed her virginity every year at the holy waters of Canathos. She spurned Zeus and had a child herself, and it goes on and on and on. There's stories from India, there's stories from Mexico, from Babylonia, and predating them all was Osiris, which again is the Mediterranean region. So there was this idea in mythology and human tradition, and I haven't gone much into the history in this lecture, but a lot of it stems from ancient Greece and ancient Egypt and Aristotle's idea of what humans were capable of doing in terms of reproduction based on the humours. And he said, this was an idea that went on for centuries, that males were the important factor in having a child because they gave everything that was important to inherit and not the mothers. And this was his logic, that both males and females had a fluid that was important in reproduction. Men had semen, and that was the fluid important in reproduction. But women had menstrual blood, and if women had menstrual blood, then they could not also have something that was important in reproducing themselves. So they served as the vessel in which the impregnated seed would grow. But just going back to Helen Spurway and whether this was a crazy idea, she had her animal models. And we also have, now we know that a lot of other animals, large animals, can also reproduce in this way. And I just put this slide up to tell you that it's not a one-size-fits-all mechanism, parthenogenesis. There are many, many ways in nature. It's not that uncommon, and there's not just one way you can do it. So Komodo dragons, like the turkeys, when they reproduce through parthenogenesis, they have sons, not daughters, as the guppies do, and as humans would, incidentally, and we'll talk about that more. The one in the middle is an ambystoma salamander, and that reproduces through a form of parthenogenesis known as kleptogenesis, which, like being a kleptomaniac, klepto meaning stealing, and they steal sperm. They steal sperm or borrow sperm from a related species, use it to kickstart their eggs into developing. But when they pass the DNA on, they discard all of the male sperm, so they're only ever passing down the genes of the female line. And the last image is of a mating ritual. The only strange thing about it is that these two lizards are both female. These are called the whiptail lizards, and there are no males in this species. And they came about when a male of a related species mated with a female of another species. Their daughter was born with a mutation that meant they didn't need to have sex to have babies. However, they still do this thing that looks just like a ritual that males and females of related species do. It's a mating position where the female on top is sort of acting as the male, and she's raising the tail of the female at the bottom. And the reason why a male would do that would be to rub their cloacas. Cloaca is the one orifice they have that does everything. And the reason they rub their cloacas together is so that the male's penis can erect, and they have two penises. They're very strange. Why would a female be doing this? There's absolutely no reason why. However, if you cut them open at the end of this ritual, you'll see something interesting, and that is the female who is acting as the male. If you look at her eggs, nothing happened. Now, nothing's happened to them. They're still tiny and unproductive. The female at the bottom, however, her eggs are mature and ready to divide. So something in that act has kick-started them into developing. So the question of, it absolutely happens in animals. Can it happen in humans? And the answer is yes, and the reason we know that it can happen is because of these flukes. These things are called teratomas, ovarian teratomas. So a woman would go to a doctor with an enlarged ovary, they'd remove a cyst, and sometimes inside that cyst, inside lots of yellow gunk, there is something that they refer to as a homunculus. And the homunculus, just to illustrate, if you look at the image on the top, that's the homunculus, and next to it is an x-ray of its skull. That was removed from a 25-year-old Japanese virgin. And if you look at it, it looks like a baby with a head down and his arm, and the skull's herniated and a brain's coming out. And the one at the bottom, you can see these beautiful teeth and skin. And the one next to it, you can see a limb, and that also had an eye in the middle of its forehead. So the point, and I put this slide on because those are so unpleasant. Someone actually took the time to crochet an ovarian teratoma. But it makes the point that in these teratomas, remember, these are things that come from a woman, and one of them was a virgin even. Her eggs divided on their own and produced what we call the ectoderm, the mesoderm, and the endoderm, all the layers that an embryo has that develops into a baby. And an egg is able to do that. It must be because all of these animals go ahead and reproduce. Within an egg is the capacity to... There are no species of animals in which there are only males, but there are many in which there are only females, and that means the egg has the capacity to generate into something. And sperm essentially is acting as a package of DNA or to kickstart an egg into dividing. So the question there next is, do these parthenogenetic human eggs that you just saw, parthenogenetic meaning they start dividing without sperm, ever develop into actual babies? And I would have said no, except in 1995, this case of this little boy came up, and he was called FD, and he turned up with the doctors for something or the other, and they took a blood sample. And his blood had 2 X chromosomes. Do you know what that means? Female, it's a female chromosome signature. So female should have 2 X's and male should have an X and a Y. Blood test showed up he had 2 X's. So the next thing they did was they took a patch of skin from him. Now remember, this is sounding a lot like Monica and her mother because their bloods all came out the same, but when they took skin off of them, they were different. Took a patch of skin from his ankle, ran the tests again, and sure enough, he was XY. Because anatomically, he was perfectly a male, and that's why they couldn't understand why this had happened. When they did further tests, they found something very, very, very incredibly, impossibly rare. Miraculous, even. That his mother had an egg that started dividing on its own and would have ended up looking like those horrific teratomas, is Greek for monstrous tumors, had it not been for the fact that his father's sperm came along and fertilized the egg, which again should never happen because once an egg has started dividing, the outside seals itself, hardens so that no more DNA could come in because too much DNA is not good. For example, Down syndrome is a tiny piece of a copy of one extra chromosome, and you have a whole range of symptoms. So if you get a whole extra set of DNA, you'd probably not make it. And FD is what's known as, he's called a chimera. A chimera. So the original chimera is a mythical beast, which is made of different animals. And the idea for when we use the term genetic chimera, and that means he has 2 different sets of DNA in his body. And there are different ways in which you can get a chimera. There was another story of a woman called Jane in Boston, and Jane was about 55 years old, and she needed a kidney transplant. Now, Jane had 3 sons. All of them obviously said, sure, we'll be happy to give you a kidney. So they went to the hospital, and they ran tests to see which one, you still need to be the most compatible with your mother. And they ran tests on the sons, and she went home, and then she got a letter from the hospital saying, 2 of your sons aren't yours, but your husband is their father. It's very, like, I could have misplaced one of my children at birth, but the chance of misplacing 2 of them, it's kind of unrealistic. So they ran tests, and what they found was that Jane was also a chimera, but in a different way. When she was in her mother's womb, she had a twin, not an identical twin, a fraternal twin who was also female. But the twin degenerated at a point early enough for her embryo to merge with Jane's, so that the ovary from which the eggs came for 2 of her sons wasn't hers, but the sister who never made it. And that's why her sons had DNA that wasn't even hers. So that this is a point that, yes, I'll be very clear on this, human eggs and all mammal eggs cannot. This is as far as they can go. They will never become babies for a very important reason, that only in 1984, I say only 1984 because I'm that old, IVF started in 1978. This is 1984, that we didn't know there was such a vital mechanism. And they discovered it when they said, we need 2 sets of DNA to make a baby. Can both come from a man or can both come from a woman? If not, why not? So they took 2 sets of female DNA from a mouse and 2 sets of male DNA and tried to make a baby. When they used 2 sets of female DNA, they got something that looked very much like that. Great skin, great teeth, great all the bits of your body that you were built with. But the thing they didn't get was a placenta. They didn't get the supporting tissues. And that's how they discovered that your placenta comes from your dad. It's absolutely essential that some genes, men and women have the same genes, but the way you inherit it is different. Some of the genes that you get from your dad are locked so that you must read them from your mother, and vice versa. Absolutely essential for mammals to have this mechanism. Now, I was talking to a professor at University College London, and his name is Sam Berry, a very lovely man, who is a great geneticist, but he's also a staunch Christian. And we were talking about virgin births and mythology and the Virgin Mary, something he's studied a lot and thought about a lot and written about a lot. Now, if you go back to Helen Spurway, the thing she noticed about her guppies was that the broods were female. If you look at the other animal species in nature with only females, they don't suddenly have sons. Komodos and turkeys do because they have a completely different chromosome setup. They don't have XY and XX, they have ZY. It works the other way, and therefore they only have sons. But one of the first things that Sam Berry said to me was, so here's the problem with Jesus. We can try and reconcile how the Virgin Mary was a virgin and a mother. I'll go into that in a minute. But the really big problem is, why wasn't Jesus a girl? Because if a woman were to have a child by a virgin birth, like animals do, because of our chromosome setup, we'd have to have a daughter. And this is Sam's, what he calls, this is how he refers to them, his biologically implausible possibilities for how the Virgin Mary could have had Jesus and still have been a virgin. And the first one is something called testicular feminization. These are when you're born, everyone thinks you're a girl. You have kind of rudimentary vagina. It's a dead end. It doesn't go anywhere. There's no womb, but there are testes. So everyone thinks you're a girl. And then you grow up and you go through puberty. You're still you don't get bodily hair. You don't get hair under your armpit. You're quite hairless. And that's because your body is insensitive to testosterone. So even though you have testes and no womb, you're producing testosterone, your body's not responsive to it, so you're getting some of the effects, but not all of the effects of it. The reason why Sam and all of these, the reason why he was talking about this was because if you're going to have a boy, if you're going to be a boy like FD, you need to have a Y chromosome from somewhere. The Y chromosome is what determines maleness, not the whole thing, but bits of it. Absolutely must have it. And so Sam was saying, okay, well, if she had testicular feminization, she'd have a Y chromosome. However, she wouldn't have a womb, and she'd probably be sterile, so that one wasn't something he proceeded with. And then she could have been a genetic chimera like Jane from Boston, except she would have had to have a twin who was fraternal and a male in order for her to get a Y chromosome. And the last thing is ovotestes, so you have both ovaries and testes, in which case you can self-fertilize. Now, the reason Sam called these biologically implausible possibilities were because if you ever have male and female hormones sloshing around, they're going to be clashing, and you'll probably be sterile. Or in some cases, you're not going to have a womb. So these possibilities aren't really going to work out. But I just wanted to say this, that when you study science or medicine, you kind of realize that the word normal doesn't really factor in a lot of cases. In fact, I was listening to a historian recently who said the word normal only entered the English dictionary in the 19th century. Until then, disability was accepted in a different way, maybe even gender. But this is the thing about what we think of female and male, that there is an XX female and an XY male, and that's the only way it is. That, as many as 1 in 100 people aren't XX and XY. And over testes, rare, but still, 1 in 83,000 people have both ovaries and testes. And there was a girl reported in Mexico City recently, so a professor friend of mine suggested that if we waited until she hit puberty, we could probably see if there was something going on there. And that's challenging ideas of normality in situations where it's naturally biological, where you're actually born with a set of chromosomes that aren't normal. But there are also technological alternatives. This mouse you see here is called Kaguya, after a mythical princess from Japan. And she's the first mammal in history who was born to 2 mothers and no father. And the reason that was possible was because that lock on the DNA I told you about, that prevents a woman from having a baby on her own, because you absolutely need DNA from a father. The scientists figured out what those locks were and when they're set, because they're not there all the time. If you take an egg early enough, they're not there yet. They converted an early egg into something that looked like sperm and used it to fertilize another egg. And she was born with 2 mothers, and the picture at the bottom is her own pups. She mated in the normal way and had pups, so she was fertile. Other ways of technologically circumventing. So, technically you don't need an egg and a sperm anymore. If a mouse could be created from 2 eggs, the chances are we could be too. In the study of infertility, a lot of people who are infertile have eggs and sperm that are dysfunctional at some stage. And it's a very convoluted, complicated process in making an egg or a sperm. And in order to understand how that works, they decided to start from scratch and build it to see what should happen and therefore what goes wrong. And the raw material they use to build egg and sperm are stem cells. And stem cells are cells which have the potential to become pretty much any cell in the body. So your skin cells normally only become another skin cell. So say if you cut yourself and your wound heals up, you're not going to grow a brain cell on your hand, you're going to grow a skin cell. However, stem cells, if you give it the right condition and messages, they can become anything else. And so some scientists have gone quite a long way, although they're not there yet at all, in getting stem cells to become sperm and become eggs. But here's the interesting thing. If you use stem cells from a female, you can generate eggs, and that makes sense. If you use the stem cells from a male, you can generate sperm, but you can also generate eggs. And that changes, or it might change, if it comes into clinical use, and predictions are that it will. Who a parent is, or what kind of couples could have a child, and what a father or a mother is. Because a man who could generate both eggs and sperm from his body could be a parent all on his own. Of course, the thing a man's missing is a womb. This guy, called Paracelsus, and he was a 16th century scientist. He wasn't a bad scientist, he just had a really wacky idea that you could grow a baby in a tube. And I mention that because his recipe was you take some semen from a man and you put it in a bottle and you bury it in horse manure for 40 days, at the end of which time you'll get a homunculus. And I'm telling that story because it stands out in his story, in his recipe, that you need sperm and you need a vessel, but you don't need a womb at all. You can use horse manure instead of a female. So women were completely out of the... But the point remains that even if you had eggs and sperm, you could generate eggs and sperm, you still need a womb. And that's something that people are working on as well. And it has been already created in Australia for a species of the grey nurse shark. This is a grey nurse shark, and it's the one with the teeth that show all the time. And people think of Jaws, but it's not. It really doesn't kill humans, but it is endangered. And in Australia, it keeps getting caught in fishing nets. And the great problem with the grey nurse shark is that they only reproduce once every 2 years. And when they reproduce once every 2 years, they only have 2 pups. And the reason they have 2 pups is because they have 2 wombs. In each womb, when they start pregnancy, there are tens of fetuses. But by the end, there's only one, because the largest, the one that develops first, is first fed by the mother when the nutrients in the semi-placenta runs out. She feeds it eggs, her own eggs, and when the eggs run out, it eats its brothers and sisters. So at the end, there's only one shark left. So the scientists thought, okay, if we can get the sharks at the beginning of pregnancy and extract all of the brothers and sisters, then we can incubate them in an artificial womb, and that's what they did. But humans obviously our placentas, our system of nutrition and oxygenation, are much more complicated than sharks. But we've also started working on sheep's and goat's fetuses. And the lining of the a womb has been grown on scaffolds in dishes in the lab. And it's a research area that scientists don't like talking about, because when there was a woman who did and got shot down, but the reason they're doing it is because actually there are a lot of women born without wombs or degenerate wombs, or women who've had cancer when they were young and had them removed, or women with heart disease who can't actually carry their own child. And you can see the demand for it by looking at the industry and surrogacy that happens around the world now. But predictions are that within 100 years we'll have something that can gestate a baby from conception until birth. And this is an image by my friend at the Royal College of Art, where she worked with, she actually made the thing, she worked with reproductive scientists at Imperial College to create this, and she said, when she takes it to exhibitions, people put their hands in and touch it. It's a very beautiful tactile thing, and I put it up because when people think about artificial wombs, they think of a corridor with metal boxes, and it's not tactile, and it's scary, and it's cold. But this is what the inspiration is, and it could be a very beautiful thing, potentially. So I'll end there. I don't know how I'm doing for time, but I just wanted to say, in studying all this and looking at how sex isn't the only way of reproduction in nature. In fact, it's not uncommon that there are many ways within different ways to have babies, and that through looking at the cutting edge science coming out of laboratories, it may be. I mean, all of this depends on political and ethical permission, but the fact is it's quite interesting to look at how biology can be adjusted and circumvented, because I guess, after all, that's what the process of evolution is. And it does throw into question the idea that man plus woman equals baby is the only way that things can be done. Thank you.
There's some amazing stuff in there, wow. If you have a question that you've been thinking about or you've been talking, stick your hand in the air and we'll gather them one at a time. We've got one straight away, so far away.
Just a clarification, really. So you were saying, if I understand right, mammals cannot reproduce. No. A woman cannot produce. A female mammal cannot reproduce on her own. She has
Naturally,
to have.
biologically cannot.
Okay. So the case of the German mother and the rabbits, that was just an impossibility.
I don't believe the rabbit story at all. No one ever replicates it. No. But the German woman. So as could be the case for Mary if it wasn't a miracle. It could be a misadventure, or she could have been assaulted while she was in hospital. But the other thing I thought was, it was during the war, and she had a boyfriend who was in the Nazi, he went off to war. Could have been that she had an affair and blanked it from her mind, because sort of people looking at the case of her coming forward and openly subjecting herself to medical testing and being splashed all over the newspapers. They compared it to sort of legal practice where, they didn't believe that she thought she was lying. She probably really believed it, and so perhaps something happened and she just blanked it from her mind.
Psychological.
Yeah.
And the reason a female mammal is to do the placenta. You have to have the male DNA creating the placenta.
Exactly.
Okay.
You'll never get that with just female DNA. And why that's the case is one of the ideas that has something to do with polygamy, that the investment of a mother is much greater than the investment of a father. And so if the father comes along and mates and goes off again, he's invested his DNA in that potential child. So it's in his interest, his part of the child's interest, to be able to suck as much nutrition from the mother as he possibly can. Placenta attaches, takes nutrients to the child. It's in her interest to block that, for her sake and for subsequent children's sake, because she needs to share that nutrition better than just giving it to all of one male child. So there's a battle going on.
So that locking comes in, you're sort of...
Exactly.
Okay.
Could you just expand on the comment you made about the placenta coming from, in human mammals, the placenta coming from the father? Like it's sort of
so there are a few hundred genes now we know about that are locked in this way. I like to describe it like if you had two copies of a book, and in one book, page 3 and 9 are unreadable. So you turn to the other copy to read page 3 and 9, and in that copy, page 11 is unreadable. So it's there, the information's there. It's just really hard to read, and the DNA's there. There's nothing wrong with the DNA. There's just something that sits on the DNA and locks it. And that thing that sits in it can be removed. And so, though females have the genes to encode a placenta, you're not able to read those instructions. And therefore you must have the instructions from male DNA, because it's readable in the male side of DNA. It's readable in what you get from your father.
So that would have to be unscrambled in that artificial...
Exactly, and that's exactly what they did. And they looked at the grand control regions for a lot of the genes that are locked in males, and were able to unlock those to get those to be expressed in females, because they're just locked. And that's how they're able to create the mouse.
Any other questions? Yes?
Was it, I forget the word, when you have both ovaries and testes and you can self-fertilise, does that happen spontaneously? Are there examples of that we know about?
No.
Would it theoretically happen spontaneously?
Well, that's the interesting. I mean, it's an interesting thought experiment, but I think the fact if you're producing female hormones, your ovaries, and male hormones, because you'd have to produce male hormones to maintain your testes and any sperm production. Sperm production is very it's sort of fragile. You really need those hormones to control it. There'd be a clash of the female and male hormones. It wouldn't really work out that well. I mean, testosterone and estrogen are produced from the same precursor. It's just cut in different ways, so that it wouldn't work out. But yeah, I was thinking, male DNA seems to control really interesting things, like certain parts of brain development, and certain behavioural disorders are found in children who have mistakes in this locking of DNA. So if your genes are supposed to be locked are not locked, you end up with some behavioural problems, and they even think that it's a father's DNA that controls the maternal behaviour of his daughters, which is really wrong.
Brave New World, how close are we?
Yeah, so the reproductive biologists who work on fertility, in terms of the womb, they're saying within 100 years. However, technology is interesting, Moore's law and all that, because sometimes when you make a change in another thing, materials, for example, if you create a material, so I'll give you an example. One of the greatest problems with incubators today, keeping premature babies alive, is getting oxygen to the baby. And then you get brain damage. The brain gets damaged very, very quickly after you are not exposed to oxygen. But a doctor in the States I met earlier this year, he's a pediatrician, and he, nothing to do with artificial wombs or reproduction, but he had a baby come in, and she, I think her lungs had failed, or there's a Lego block in her throat or something, and by the time she came in, they put her in the heart-lung bypass. That takes 20 minutes. It takes 2 minutes for some of your brain to start dying, and your neurons don't regenerate, so brain damage is permanent. It takes 20 minutes to get that child's lungs and her lungs going again, to pump blood around. And she died, and he said, this is not good enough. And so he developed a way to inject oxygen directly into your blood. Now, you can't just inject oxygen into your blood because it's toxic, it's highly toxic. You couldn't just put a syringe in and get oxygen. Normally it has to go through your lungs and all that. But he worked with nanotechnologists and created something like soap bubbles which coat the oxygen so that when it goes into your body it makes it palatable. Thinking about saving children's life, you can see how that applies to making art. So change in some material or some nanotech or someone somewhere could speed things along. So predictions in science, and things may never happen, but things may happen even faster. So artificial women could be here faster. And a few years ago when I was talking to a stem cell scientist about the eggs and sperm from stem cells, I said to him, "What do you think?" He said, "I got a patent." He said, "I got a patent application from America, someone wanting to patent the creation of eggs and sperm from stem cells." I said, "What do you do with it?" He said, "I put it in the bin." I said, "Why?" He said, "We won't be able to do it for at least 15 to 20 years." And I said, "But that's when my daughter will be reproductively active. I mean, that's not a long time to wait." So there were governmental panels talking about ethical considerations for when this goes into clinical use for infertility. At the moment, you're only allowed to use eggs and sperm that come from ovaries and testes. So that will have to change in law, because if you're generating, if you're not generating healthy eggs and sperm in your reproductive organs, and you can create it from your skin cells or your other stem cells, then that's a good way to bypass infertility. So it's considered to be a great hope for the infertile.
When you've talked about these topics before, the new technologies and where they might go, what kind of objections do people have? Because on the one hand, you could see potentially, all of this could really help the infertile. On the other hand, quite a lot of it feels unnatural. There's something odd about it.
I think there's nothing as scary as something so closely linked to our humanity as having babies. It's quite threatening. Quite a threatening thing. So people who hate it, and the people who, when I speak to fertility scientists, they say there's always stuff in the papers about people saying this is wrong and unnatural, but as soon as a newspaper story comes out about sperm being created, you get hundreds of phone calls. I mean, the phone never stops ringing because people want this, and fertility is a massive industry in the world. I hadn't realised. When I was an undergraduate, I was doing research into sperm development, and I remember thinking, wow, there's a lot of funding going into this, but why would anyone want a baby so much? Because I was 20. But we are having babies later and becoming increasingly infertile because, one of the reasons is because fertility plummets after 35, after 30. And after 35, a woman's considered an older mother in hospitals. And it becomes, your eggs start degenerating, you get mutations, that mean the embryo's not that healthy and all of that. So we might all need this technology one day.
You can imagine a world when there's demand for it. Can you imagine a world when it's gone through all of whatever the processes are to make it legal? What sort of steps do they have to go through?
There'll be boards of ethicists, and they already started because they were looking at bringing this into clinical usage. But I don't think it'll be just like IVF. I mean, people who need IVF use IVF, but the people who don't even give it a second thought. So it won't be everyone. But I speak to an ethicist who said, there are people who choose not to have children, and that's fine. But why should the ones who are born without the ability to have children, why should that be forced upon them? Because why shouldn't they also have the choice? So I guess this sort of equalises it for all humans, those who decide they don't want to and those who really can't but really want to.
That's another question.
How do you get onto an ethics board? What sort of qualifications?
How would you get onto an ethics board?
Yeah, what sort of
So who are the people?
Believe it or not, there are people who are trained ethicists in biomedical science at many universities around the world.
So as a member of the public,
absolutely.
could you get involved as a member of the public, or do you have to be trained?
Yeah, we were talking about this before. So I worked on a bill at Parliament on stem cells and the use of some stem cells that are being created from using animal eggs and human DNA. And the government proposed to ban it, and there was a huge outcry about it. But only in people who didn't like that sort of thing. The scientists wanted to do the research and the patient groups because it's one of the options they have for conditions like Alzheimer's and Parkinson's, which are chronic neurological conditions where there is no cure, no hope for a cure, unless they start exploring these things. And in the end, the body regulating it went to the public. I mean, went to high streets and shopping centres and pulled people out, brought the ethicists and scientists, and they gave both sides of the why people don't want it, why you might not want it, and why you might want it. And overwhelmingly people said that, you know what, if it could help someone, then that's fine. So they are public consultations. The Parliament tends to, if you look on their website, they have inquiries from time to time about various things. And they invite submissions from you, me, anyone. It's just that the people in the know, like we had a lot of letters from the Christian Lawyers Fellowship, we had a lot of letters from scientific bodies, because they're the only ones who really cared enough to look at the website. And people only realised they could feed into it when they were pulled off the high street. But you can go on and have a look and give your input, and that's good, because we should know what's going on in research, and we should be able to feed into it, because ultimately it affects all of us.
And you said there's a big industry. So
Industry, I mean, you know,
where does the money come from for all the research?
Have you seen adverts on the tube for donor eggs and things? I mean, it's incredibly expensive, and it's so the NHS fund IVF for some people, but if your likelihood of getting pregnant through it is low, i.e. if you're an older parent, you're not going to get it on the NHS. But really, it's the older parents who tend to want to do it, and so there is a divide economically where people who can afford it tend to do it.
And are they going private then?
Private, and if you can't afford to go private, because it is incredibly expensive. There's an advert on the radio for some Harley Street clinic saying, it's Christmas, we'll give you £100 off a consultation. Like, how much is a consultation? 100. So they're going to India, to Ukraine, to places like that where it's cheaper. And so in a way, you know, being able to produce eggs and sperm from stem cells of someone who's infertile, to give them good sperm and eggs, to me it's more ethical than going to a country where you're paying a woman. Because donating eggs is an invasive process, and it's not really donating. Very rarely is it altruistic. Like being a surrogate mother is very rarely altruistic. People do it altruistically, out of the goodness of their heart, but very rarely. And so the Indian government has legalized the commercialization of surrogacy, so that women are paid something like 5 years' salary compared to what they normally get. You don't see rich women doing it. So there's a woman who needs the money, and it's ethically, yes, this is technology and it might sound scary, but at the same time it might give you a more ethical option than what people are already doing today.
So some of the funding for treatments is in this kind of private market, and people selling eggs or being surrogates. But where does the money for the actual research come from? Is that kind of taxpayers' money, or is it private money? So who's funding this kind of cutting edge research?
That's public funding and medical research funds.
So it's the people like the Medical Research Council, Wellcome Trust.
Yeah, exactly. Understand. You know, when I give this talk in a different way, I talk a lot about the history of it, and it is astounding that we didn't even know that mammals had eggs. I told you that Aristotle said it was, even Leonardo da Vinci, who did dissections, because for a big part of history dissections were prescribed. So Aristotle didn't cut anyone open. Galen did a bit later, but Galen had access to the bodies of gladiators, who were men. And he developed this reversal theory where he said women are men in reverse. So men's testicles are like women's ovaries, flipped inwards. So he said women are men in reverse, but less perfect. And and that idea went on. You can see in Da Vinci's drawings, even though he looked. So it was so influential. We didn't know mammals had eggs. William Harvey, who you know from the circulation of the blood, the king gave him access to his flock of deer. And he herd. And he looked for an egg, but he couldn't find it, until we had microscopes and things. And it wasn't until 1826 that someone found an egg in a dog, which was 100 and something years, in less than 200 years ago. By that time, we'd already patented the internal combustion engine, but we didn't know that mammals had eggs. And it wasn't until 1928 that anyone knew a human had an egg. So everyone thought incredible. So the point is, in doing these studies that are funded by medical research and taxpayers' money, isn't it incredible that we still don't know so much about something so essential to us and how we are made? And so, even if it's not about fertility, that's our basic research on this, means that we can understand the process of how we develop. That surely is essential, because a lot of babies are born with developmental problems that we need to understand why it happens. We need to understand what's going on in the DNA from what they started, what we started from.
So it sounds like we've come quite a long way in 100 years from not even knowing that we had X to being able to potentially make human babies.
And this thing about this locks in the DNA was found a few years after we did IVF. And it's like, how, we really didn't know that? That's become a whole field in itself. There's genomics and there's epigenomics. There's the epigenome. You've heard of the human genome. Now they're studying the epigenome, which is those locks on DNA that are reversible, that you put on and take off. Because that is why, you know, if you look at in the group at King's College looking at psychiatric patients, they're doing twin studies. Identical twins are a great way to compare genes because genetically they're identical, but sometimes one person's got a psychiatric condition and the brother doesn't. And why? And sometimes you see that these little locks on the DNA are there or not there in the right places. And that comes from environmental influence as well. So there's so much we just are probably as ignorant as the people who thought that we didn't have eggs, but just in different ways. And so we need to keep looking.
So it kind of sounds, in summary, if the question was, is virgin birth, has it happened? Probably not. But could it happen in the future?
Technologically, maybe.
It could. Well, thank you very much, Aarathi.